Hello, Professor Dr. Francis Robinson. Welcome to our show. Thank you very much for being with us. Uh, can you please tell us about the social, political, and religious state of the Muslims in the British India?
Okay. We'll have to divide this up into political, social, and religious. And I think we also have to recognize that the situation is changing from the early or late 18th, early 19th century through to 1947. Politically, we really can't talk about the Muslims. They're very divided, and divided throughout the time that they're operating, that the British are in India. They're divided by language. You have Bengalis, Punjabis, you have people in the United Provinces, you have people in Tamil Nadu, people in Kerala, people in Hyderabad. They all have different interests. They're all placed differently politically. And so there's no world in which you can talk about a united Muslim community. Moreover, the systems don't exist to create a united Muslim community. The telegraph only begins in the 1850s and 1860s. The press, again, begins to get going in a serious way in the second half of the 19th century. The railway only begins to unite the country in the second half of the 19th century. And there is no world in which there's any united Muslim community. As British rule develops, and particularly as we get into the last 30 years of British rule, power begins to be devolved on different provinces, like the Punjab, like Bihar, like Bengal, like the UP. Muslims in those different provinces all acquire primarily provincial interests, which become much more important to them than any, in inverted commas, national interest that might be represented by the All India Muslim League. So the nature of Muslim politics in British India, really from the beginning of the 19th century down to 1947, is largely one of division, of divided interests. Now, you mentioned socially. Simply, and this is a very simple division, you could divide India's Muslims between the, if you like, the Sharif classes or the Ashraf, many of them descendants of former Mughal courtiers and civil servants, many of them either having genealogies that go back into Arabia or Iran or Central Asia, many of them having invented genealogies that go back into those areas. So there is an area, a level of people who call themselves Sharif folk, associated either with the former rule of the Mughals or their successor states, or subsequently with British rule. Beneath that, you've got a whole world of traders and artisans, typically found in many of the towns of, say, the United Provinces. But beyond that, you've got a huge level of essentially peasants. In Bengal, Punjab, two great peasant areas, and quite a substantial group of peasants in the United Provinces as well. So, in social terms, this is a world that's divided. And Syed Ahmad Khan, in talking to the Hunter Education Commission in 1882, made it very clear that he didn't really regard these Muslim peasants as having anything to do with the kind of Muslims that he was and the kind of Muslim world that he represented. So, divided in class terms. Thirdly, you mentioned religion, and obviously you have the old divisions of Shia, Sunni, Ismaili, and so on. But the whole business of responding to British rule in the 19th century leads to the development of what one might call various, in inverted commas, sects. So the Deobandis emerge with a particular idea of how they're going to respond to British rule. The followers of Ahmad Reza Khan, Barelvi, they also merge with a rather different idea of how they're going to respond to British rule. You have the Ahl Hadith and the Ahl Quran with their own idea of how they're going to respond to the challenges represented by British rule. And you have old families like the Ferengi family who are very much concerned, rather like the Barelvis in fact, to maintain the old forms of learning and not take undue risks in responding to British rule. And then beyond that, of course, you have people like Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian, who has his own particular response to British rule. And that creates a whole series of divisions, religious divisions, which you will be very well aware exist right up to the present amongst the Muslims of South Asian origin.
Here I would like to ask you, looking at the situation you've just explained, that we're generally aware of this is how the state of the Muslims were. Did the British really need to sort of launch a conspiracy theory to disintegrate and disunite Muslims?
Well, first of all, I would say the British Empire didn't launch a conspiracy theory, nor was there any attempt by the British to, as you say, disunite Muslims. Indeed, moving very quickly to Muhammad Ali Johar, you may remember his famous phrase in the 1930 roundtable conferences in London. He said, "We divide, you rule." So Muslims are, as I've already explained to you, highly divided. So there's no need for the British to say this is a hugely united group who represent a massive threat to us. The British are well aware that they're very divided in all kinds of ways. This doesn't mean that, of course, there can't be from time to time worries about what Muslims might be able to do should they unite. But there was a little bit of playing with the ideas of a conspiracy theory in relation to the mutiny uprising of 1857-58. And there was talk of sort of Wahhabis in the 1860s. But by the 1870s, all that thought had disappeared. And essentially, there was really no considerable fear or no sense that there was any need to use divide and rule amongst the Muslims.
So if the Deobandis and the Barelvis were the main representatives of the mainstream Muslims in South Asia, how did they respond to the British rule? What was a strategy, if any, to respond to the British colonial rule in India?
Well, first of all, you can do this at several levels. One level is the religious response. So if you think about the Deobandis, what they create is what we've come to term in inverted commas, scriptural Protestant, in inverted commas, Islam. So the individual is focused on the Quran Hadith. The individual is told that there is no get-out clause. There's no way in which you can go to a Sufi Pir and say, Baba Razak, please intercede for me with Allah. What the Deobandi concern is to make sure that you know what your Islamic obligations are, that you know it's only if you follow the guidance that God has given you that you will survive. The Deobandi techniques also encourage you to reflect regularly on how well you're meeting your obligations. And it's really between you and God, ultimately, as to whether you will be saved at the Day of Judgment. There's nothing apart from your own efforts. So what very specifically the Deobandi training does is develop the individual human conscience as the basis on which an Islamic society will be created in India at a time when Muslims no longer have power. Don't have political, physical power, so use the power of the individual human conscience to create a Muslim society. The Barelvis operate in a very different way. They receive all the traditional learning. They continue to believe very profoundly in the idea of intercession at saints' tombs. If there is a slightly new development in their thinking, it is emphasizing the Prophet Muhammad as a guide, and the Barelvis developed the idea of the light of Muhammad as a particularly important guide. And in Barelvi practices, things like Maulud and all forms of other respect for the Prophet become a much bigger dimension. So the Barelvis are very traditional in the way in which they operate. Their ideally, it's often said the way of being Muslim is very much related to the countryside rather than the town, and a world in which the Sufi pir will play a much bigger role. So the Barelvis, traditional, the Deoband is doing something very new and very different, fashioning the individual human conscience. And now that was just an answer on religious terms. Do you want the answer on political terms?
Obviously, yes.
Yes,
Responding to the British colonial rule.
Okay. Well, as far as British colonial rule is concerned, it is said, and it is probably true, that there are some people who come to be part of Deoband who are involved in the mutiny uprising in Tana Bahwan in Saharanpur in 1857-58. But in the early years of Deoband, Deoband was operating in a British district. The Deobandis, as far as we can make out, really keep their heads down and concentrate on the business of developing their madrasa and their particular forms of teaching. And when they need assistance, for instance, there is a moment when they have to they need support when a group from Deoband town try and take over the madrasa, they call in the British collector in order to arbitrate. Much later on, in World War I, they invite the Lieutenant Governor of the UP, Sir James Meston, to come and visit Deoband. And he describes his visit to Deoband and saying what an extraordinary place it is, and saying it's just like being in a medieval university. And obviously rather liked his visit. So relations, though not warm, are actually rather better than perhaps Deobandi historians might have wanted you to believe subsequently. And it's only really around 1919, 2021, with the development of the Khilafat movement and the non-cooperation movement, that the Deobandis begin to move. Well, and also I think we have to acknowledge the influence of Mahmud al-Hassan, great leader of Deoband. They begin to move in a more distinctively anti-British way. As for the Barelvis, I have to say I have not gone through the detail of Ahmad Reza Khan's relationships with the British. But I can tell you that really between the period 1913-14, 1920-21, and Ahmad Reza Khan dies in 1921, the Barelvis are throughout this period taking a line which could be called pro-British. They're not saying hurrah for King George V, as far as I know, but what they are doing is saying we do not support this pan-Islamist movement which Maulana Abdul Bari of Ferengi Mahal has established, the Anjumani Kodame Kaaba. And I think Ahmad Reza Khan produces a fatwa against it. Again, when the Khilafat organization gets going in 1919-20, there's another fatwa from Ahmad Reza Khan saying no, we're not supporting that. And when the Khilafat movement and the Congress launch a non-cooperation movement against the British, Ahmad Reza Khan holds a conference in Bareilly supporting the British, an anti-non-cooperation movement. So certainly in that period, the Barelvis seem to be taking, if not a pro-British line, a line that is against the other Indian ulama who are taking a different line.
How would you comment on one of the allegations that is made on the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, that he was planted by the British with the intention of disuniting Muslims?
I told you it's absolute nonsense that the British had anything to do with the emergence of Mullah Muhammad.
That was very, very informative, Professor Francis Robinson. Thank you ever so much for being on our show. Thank you very much.